She accused her of looking so much like her husband. You both think I am dumb to accept the narrative that your mother abandoned you with my husband. How can a mother do such to her own child? She queried Nara. Leave my house this minute. She screamed at Nara, who fearfully ran out of the house and sat in front of their gate. Heavy rain began to fall, and Nara sat there alone as the rain poured down heavily, soaking her to the bone. Nara stood in her mother's room, her heart heavy with sadness, as she watched her mother completely absorbed in her work. It was her birthday, and Nara could not remember the last time that her mother paid any form of attention to her. She yearned for some love and attention from her mother, but her mother's focus remained solely on her work.
Mommy, it is my birthday.
She said excitedly, but her mother looked her in the eyes and asked why anyone should be happy about that.
Your birthday is the worst day of my life. So why should I rejoice and celebrate a day that I wish I could erase forever? You are my deepest regret, Nara, and I wish you had never been born.
Nara stood there broken to hear such hurtful words from her mother, whose eyes were filled with hatred for her.
What kind of life is this? Why do you have to always stress my life?
Her mother said to her as she walked her out of her presence in anger. Nara ran out of the house, feeling so sad and dejected. She got on her little bicycle and began to ride as she cried bitterly at the hurtful words that her mother had said to her. Nara rode her bicycle towards the major road, hoping to run to the ends of the earth. She had no idea where she was going, but decided to ride her bicycle till she was worn out and unable to ride again. With each pain that she felt, she pedaled the bicycle, pouring all her frustrations to the wind. Nara rode her bicycle for a few minutes and arrived a major expressway. The road did not seem too busy, so Nara decided to ride on the highway. A few minutes later, a young man who was having a heated argument with his wife on the phone took his eyes off the road for a second, and before he knew what was happening, his car ran into Nara, who fell to the ground unconscious. Shocked and terrified, Mr. Duru ran out of his car and saw Nara lying in front of his car unconscious. In that moment, his entire body shook as he rushed her to the hospital. The doctors, after careful examination, revealed to him that Nara was now in a coma. Mr. Duru could not believe what he had gotten himself into. His wife kept calling his phone to know where he was, accusing him of being with another woman, not knowing that their argument had resulted in a fatal accident. Look at all the trouble you have put me into, he said to his wife, informing her that he was currently at the hospital with a child that he had hit with his car. His wife, after a few minutes, arrived at the hospital to meet her husband. She saw Nara lying on the hospital bed unconscious and could not believe what her actions had caused. We need to contact her family, Mrs. Duru said to her husband as they wondered how they would find her family, owing to the fact that Nara had nothing on her except her bicycle. Let's check her bicycle, Mr. Duru said as they rushed to his car to inspect the bicycle and found an address taped to the side of the cycle. This must be her house address, they said to themselves as they drove quickly to the address and met her mother, Nneka, who did not seem worried to hear of her daughter's condition. Your daughter is in a coma, Mr. and Mrs. Duru said to Nneka, who asked them what they wanted her to do about it. They looked at themselves confused and wondered if Nneka was truly her mother. You need to come and see your daughter in the hospital, they said to Nneka, who told them that she was coming. She walked into her house and banged the door behind her, leaving the young couple in complete shock. Are you sure you don't know her? Mrs. Duru asked her husband, who rolled his eyes disappointed at what his wife had just said. How am I sure that this was not your plan? She said to her husband, who looked at her confused as they returned back to the hospital. When they arrived at the hospital, Mr. and Mrs. Duru approached the doctor, who informed them that Nara might wake up soon. They waited patiently for hours, but Nara's mother did not arrive. We have to go home now, she said to her husband, who insisted on remaining in the hospital as he could not stand leaving Nara all alone in her state.
Why do you have to stay with her all night in the hospital?
Mrs. Duru asked her husband angrily as she stormed out of the hospital alone. Her husband slept in the hospital all night, praying for Nara's swift recovery, and by morning, he woke up to a loud sneeze. Nara had finally woken up. Where am I? What am I doing here? Nara asked as she tried to wrap her head around why she was lying on a hospital bed. Mr. Duru explained to her that she was involved in an accident as he mistakenly ran her over in her bicycle the previous day. Where is my mother? Nara asked and was told that her mother was yet to arrive. Just as they were talking, his wife called his phone and was informed that Nara had gained consciousness. The doctors, after examining Nara, decided that she had to remain in the hospital for a few days for observation to ensure that there were no lasting effects from the accident. Mr. Duru ensured to provide all her needs, and as the days went by, he continued to visit Nara daily, bringing her food and gifts as he did everything possible to cheer her up. Mr. Duru felt a growing sense of responsibility for Nara, especially as her own mother seemed so indifferent about her. His wife, however, remained distant, unable to understand why her husband was so invested in Nara's recovery. The morning of her discharge finally came, and Mr. Duru drove Nara back home and was shocked to realize that her mother Neka no longer lived in her house. She packed out a few days ago without telling anyone where she was going. They searched the entire place for her, but Nneka was nowhere to be found. Confused and stuck, Mr. Duru decided to take Nara home to live with them. His wife, on seeing Nara in their home, asked what she was doing there, and her husband revealed to her that Nara had nowhere else to go and was going to live with them for a while till he finds her mother or her family members. You must be kidding, Mrs. Duru said to her husband as she told him to take the girl back to where she belongs. Do you think I will let you bring your side chick's daughter into our home? She said as she gave her husband a very stern look. Mr. Duru told his wife that Nara was going to remain in his house till he finds her family, and that was final. Mrs. Duru threatened to leave their home if her husband insisted that Nara would live with them, and her husband told her to do as she pleases, and this filled her with so much anger. He showed Nara to the visitor's room, and Nara was so grateful to him for helping her. She could not stop thinking about her mother and the fact that she abandoned her with total strangers. Nara was so heartbroken. Mrs. Duru, however, believed that something was up. She believed that Nara was not just an ordinary stranger her husband brought home. She believed that Nara was the daughter of one of her husband's side chick, and the more this thought went through her mind, the more agitated she became. I'll make sure that this girl leaves my home, even if it's the last thing that I do, she said to herself as she walked into her room angrily. The next morning, Nara was asleep in her room when Mrs. Duru walked into the room to warn her to leave her home. Nara pleaded with her, saying that she had nowhere else to go, and Mrs. Duru refused to listen to her cries.
You useless girl. You think I don't know that my husband is your father?
She said to Nara as she accused her of looking so much like her husband. You both think I am dumb to accept the narrative that your mother abandoned you with my husband. How can a mother do such to her own child? She queried Nara. Leave my house this minute. She screamed at Nara, who fearfully ran out of the house and sat in front of their gate. Heavy rain began to fall, and Nara sat there alone as the rain poured down heavily, soaking her to the bone. She shivered from the cold, but the pain in her heart was even greater than the chill of the rain. She couldn't understand why her life had taken such a dark turn, or why the people who were supposed to love and care for her had abandoned her so cruelly. As she sat there, lost in her own thoughts, Mr. Duru arrived home from work. He was stunned to see Nara sitting outside in the rain, drenched and shivering. Rushing out of his car, he hurried over to her, his heart filled with concern. "Nara, what are you doing out here in the rain?" he asked, kneeling beside her and pulling her into his arms. Nara looked up at him with tear-filled eyes, her lips trembling.
I was told to leave.
She whispered, barely able to speak through the sobs that threatened to choke her. Mr. Duru felt a surge of anger and disbelief. "Who told you to leave? Was it my wife?" Nara nodded silently, her face filled with sorrow.
She thinks I am your daughter.
Mr. Duru's eyes widened in shock. He knew his wife could be suspicious and jealous, but he never imagined she would take it this far. "That's nonsense, Nara," he said firmly. "You are not my daughter, and you don't deserve to be treated this way." He helped Nara to her feet and led her back into the house, ignoring the storm of emotions swelling inside of him. When they entered the house, Mrs. Duru was waiting, her arms crossed and her face hard with anger.
What do you think you're doing?
She demanded, glaring at her husband.
I told this girl to leave, and you bring her back inside? You really do think I'm a fool, don't you?
Mr. Duru took a deep breath, struggling to control his temper. "This is enough, Ada," he said, using her name to emphasize the seriousness of the situation. "Nara is not my daughter. She is a child who needs our help, and I will not stand by and watch you throw her out into the streets." Mrs. Duru raged in anger, her jealousy clouding her sense of judgment.
Help? Or is it guilt? Guilt because she's yours, and you've been hiding it all this time?
She asked her husband, who shook his head, tired of his wife's insecurities. "Nara is not my child, Ada. She is a child in need, abandoned by her own mother. I took responsibility of her because it's the right thing to do. And if you can't see that, then maybe you need to think about what kind of a person you are." For a moment, silence filled the room as Mrs. Duru stood there, filled with so much emotions welling. She returned to her room, leaving her husband with Nara, who was still shivering from the cold. Mr. Duru turned to Nara and covered her with a blanket, assuring her that she would remain in his home till he was able to find her mother or another safe place for her to live. Nara was so grateful to him as she thanked him for being so kind to her. Mrs. Duru, however, sat in her room, fuming in anger as she waited for her husband, who walked in to meet her.
So you have decided to choose your daughter over me?
She said angrily to him as her husband, for the umpteenth time, informed her that Nara was not his daughter.
Then why does she look so much like you?
She asked her husband, who could not understand what she was talking about. "How can you say Nara looks so much like me?" He replied her, accusing her of allowing her insecurities to make her see things that we are not. "Is this how you want God to bless us with our own child?" he asked his wife, whose eyes filled with tears. The words stung her deeply because despite her jealousy and anger, the truth was that she longed for a child of her own. Her frustration and insecurity consumed her, heightening her jealousy as she watched her husband care for a child that looked like him in some way. Mr. Duru's heart softened as he saw the pain in his wife's eyes. He reached out to her, trying to take her hands, but his wife walked out on him angrily as she locked herself up in the bathroom. "I'm sorry, love," he said to his wife as he apologized to her for hurting her deeply with his words. Mrs. Duru, in that moment, thought deeply about her life and actions as she decided to do what's best for her family. The next day, she walked up to Nara in her room, her face beaming with joy, and Nara could not believe what she was seeing. "I'm taking you shopping this morning," she said to Nara, who jumped up excitedly as she had never gone shopping in her life before. She quickly accompanied Mrs. Duru into the car as they drove off to the mall, which was a long distance from their home. Mrs. Duru took Nara into the mall and met a family friend who who saw them together and complimented Nara for looking so much like her husband. Mrs. Duru smiled at her as they discussed for a few minutes and said their goodbyes. They continued their shopping and Nara was so excited to pick out a new doll. They stood at the doll aisle when Mrs. Duru realized that she left her purse in her car.
Nara, wait here for me. Let me quickly grab my purse.
She said, smiling as Nara smiled back at her and watched her leave. Nara looked back at the aisle, happy as she could not make up her mind on the doll that she wanted. She could not believe how kind Mrs. Duru was to her and couldn't wait to return home with all the beautiful things that she had picked. She stood there and waited for Mrs. Duru, who was now taking so long to return. Nara sat in the corner of the shop, waiting, but Mrs. Duru never returned. It was then that Nara realized that Mrs. Duru brought her to the mall to abandon her. Tears poured down her eyes as she had never been this terrified and confused in her entire life. Nara's heart raced as the realization sank in. She had been betrayed and abandoned for the second time in her life by a woman who she had begun to love and trust. Nara sat in the corner of the shop, holding on to her brown teddy bear. She had no idea what to do or where to go. The world around her felt too big, too scary and too unforgiving. She wished she could disappear or that someone would be so kind as to save her. Night came and Mr. Duru returned home to meet the house quiet. His wife was up in her room and he walked into Nara's room to realize that Nara was nowhere to be found. "Where is Nara?" he asked his wife, who feigned ignorance and asked him if she was Nara's keeper.
I don't know where Nara is.
She replied her husband, who began to panic and call on Nara, but Nara was nowhere to be found. Mrs. Duru sat in her room as the words of their family friend at the mall kept ringing in her ears. "She looks so much like your husband." The words echoed in her head repeatedly as she knew that her husband was definitely hiding something away from her. Seeing him panic at the thought of losing Nara made it even more convincing that Nara was his secret daughter, who he believed he could sneak into their home under the guise of helping a poor and abandoned child. Mrs. Duru decided to conduct a test of Nara and her husband to satisfy her growing convictions. She took the required samples and submitted to her friend at a lab, who conducted the test and revealed to her that her husband was the father of the child. "I knew it," she said to herself as she confronted her husband with the result.
You see, I was right all along.
She yelled angrily at him as she accused him of infidelity and trying to deceive her into caring for another woman's child. Her husband said no word to her as he walked into his room, locking his door behind him. Mrs. Duru sat on the sofa in the room, fuming in anger. Her mind raced as she could not believe that her husband had a child with another woman.
How could he fool me so easily?
She thought to herself as she remembered how Nara's mother acted on the day that they both went to inform her of her daughter's condition at the hospital. No wonder she never bothered to come to the hospital. She thought to herself as she acknowledged how well her husband put up an act in front of her, pretending not to know who Nara's mother was.
I have indeed been fooled,
she said to herself as she thought of what to do. By morning, Mrs. Duru was sitting alone in the living room when her husband got out of his room and grabbed his car keys.
Where are you going?
She asked him, but he ignored her and got into his car and drove away.
I said it. He's going to meet his side chick,
she thought to herself as she grabbed her keys too and decided to trail him. Mrs. Duru secretly followed her husband and arrived at Nara's mother's house. She watched from a distance as her husband walked towards the door and began to knock. To her amazement, she saw Nara's mother, who came out to answer the door. Mrs. Duru was so shocked to see Nara's mother in her home.
This woman did not move after all,
she thought to herself, feeling so used and deceived.
These people fooled me,
she said as she sat in her car and watched them argue for a few minutes and walk into Nara's mother's house. Her heart raced as she sat there, tears pouring down her eyes as she felt the weight of betrayal by her own husband, who she knew was clearly hiding something away from her. Unable to contain her emotions, she decided to return home when suddenly her husband walked out of the house with Nara's mother as they both drove off in his car.
This is interesting.
Mrs. Duru said to herself as she wiped her tears and continued to trail them. A few minutes later, they arrived at their family hospital and walked in together. Mrs. Duru could not help but follow as she was so curious to know why her husband and his side chick were going to the hospital together.
Maybe they finally found Nara.
She thought to herself as she followed them into the hospital, curious to see what she was going to find. As she walked into the hospital, she saw her husband and Nara's mother talking to a doctor. Filled with curiosity, she approached them, damning every consequence as she asked them what was going on. Her husband, shocked to see her there, asked how she found them, but she dismissed his question, insisting to know why her husband and Nara's mother were in the hospital talking to the doctor. It was then that her husband revealed to her that Nara was their child. Mrs. Duru opened her eyes in shock as she tried to understand what they were talking about. What she did not know was that her baby was swapped with that of another woman who gave birth on the same day that she gave birth. The evil nurse handed her the woman's dead baby, not caring about the consequence of her action. What had happened was that at the time that she gave birth, a certain nurse worked in the hospital and made it her duty to swap babies. There were so many cases of swapped babies at the time, and the hospital could not get hold of all the affected patients because the evil nurse burnt all the medical records that could tie her to the crime. This made tracing all affected patients difficult as the hospital reported the case to the authorities, who arrested and convicted her for her crime. The doctor apologized to Mr. and Mrs. Duru as well as Nneka for the misunderstandings that this might have caused them. Mrs. Duru stood there, unable to utter a word. Nara, the girl she hated with all of her heart, turned out to be her own daughter, a child she never knew existed till this moment. Heartbroken and defeated, Mrs. Duru could not believe that she abandoned her own daughter in the middle of the busy mall alone. Her heart broke as she wondered where her daughter could be and if she was safe. She quickly ran out of the hospital and drove straight to the mall. She arrived at the shop where she left her daughter and asked everyone that worked there if they saw Nara, but no one seemed to have seen her around. Mrs. Duru screamed out in pain. She could not believe what she had done to herself because of jealousy. Her husband, wondering where she ran off to in a hurry, called her phone to know where she was, and that was when she informed him of all that happened on that day. How could you? He asked his wife, who began to apologize to him for all the terrible things that she had done. After hours of parading the mall, she arrived home and met her husband, who refused to speak or look at her. She could feel how angry he was towards her and could not stop pleading with him for forgiveness. What did Nara ever do to you? He asked his wife, who could not stop crying.
I abandoned my own daughter in the mall,
she said to herself as she sat there, crying, confused on what to do. Night came, and Mrs. Duru could not get herself to sleep. All she could remember was the joy on Nara's face when they arrived the mall that morning, and how happy she was to pick out the beautiful dolls that she said that she wanted. I should have just bought the dolls for you, she said as she wept bitterly, wishing that she could turn back the hands of time. That night was the longest night that she had ever had. Her heart was so heavy and her thoughts filled with so many terrible situations that her daughter could have faced alone, all because of her insecurity and wickedness. Nara, please return back to me, she cried repeatedly as she stayed awake, calling on Nara's name repeatedly as tears poured out of her eyes. Morning came, and Mrs. Duru was still awake. She heard a knock on her bedroom door and ignored it for minutes. The knock was so persistent annoying her greatly as she wasn't in the mood to see anyone that morning. Filled with rage, she approached the door, screaming for whoever it is to go away. When she opened the door and saw Nara standing in front of the door, "Am I dreaming?" she asked herself as tears poured down her eyes. Her husband, who was approaching them at the time, told her that she wasn't dreaming. "Where did you find her?" she asked her husband, who informed her that on the day that she abandoned Nara at the shopping mall, their family friend, who she came across in the shopping mall that day, saw Nara sitting all alone, crying, and called his number. She said that she tried calling your number repeatedly, but it did not connect, so she searched for my number and called me instead. "Your daughter Nara is in the shopping mall all alone," she said as she handed Nara over to the chief security officer of the mall, who kept her safe till I arrived. When I arrived the mall, I saw Nara, who looked so terrified. I drove her immediately to my sister's house, pleading with her to keep her safe until I find her mother, not knowing that she was our daughter. Mrs. Duru in that moment fell on her knees as she pleaded with Nara to forgive her for all the terrible things that she did to her. "I never knew you were my daughter," she cried out loud as she promised never to treat anyone in such a terrible way, regardless of their relationship to her. She learned her lessons, and Nara, being a kind and loving girl, forgave her mother, who did everything within her power to make up for the horrible things that she did. She also apologized to her husband for never trusting him and for all the time she allowed her insecurity to rid them of their peace, and her husband forgave her and assured her that his love for her was unwavering. Nneka, the woman Nara lived with for most of her life, paid them a visit to apologize to Nara for how badly she treated her. She revealed that she fell in love with a man who she never knew was living with HIV. He infected her with the virus and got her pregnant, leaving her to care for the child all alone. All she did to Nara stemmed from the resentment and anger she bore in her heart for him. Little did she know that Nara was not her own daughter. She apologized to Nara for all that she put her through, saying that this experience has taught her a valuable lesson that she would never forget in her life. Nara forgave her in a heartbeat as they parted ways and never saw each other again. Mr. and Mrs. Duru, we are so delighted to be finally reunited with their daughter, who had gone through so much trauma for all these years. Mrs. Duru, now fully aware of the pain she had caused both her husband and her daughter, committed herself to rebuilding the trust she had so carelessly shattered. She spent every waking moment with Nara, trying to make up for the lost time and the cruel actions she had taken. She showered Nara with love and attention, taking her to places she had never been, buying her gifts, and most importantly, offering her the motherly affection that Nara had always craved. Nara, though initially wary, slowly began to open up to her mother. She was a resilient and forgiving child, and despite all she had been through, she wanted to believe that this new warmth from her mother was genuine. The nightmares of being abandoned slowly faded as she settled into the comforting routine of her new life, filled with love and care. As weeks turned into months, the Duru family became so inseparable. They enrolled Nara in a good school, where she made friends and excelled in her studies. The home that had once been cold and filled with mistrust was now warm with laughter echoing through its walls. The lesson to be learned from this story is that we should never act out of impulse or fill our hearts with hatred for another. Be loving, kind and tender-hearted towards everyone you meet, and treat people the way you would like to be treated. Do not repay evil for evil, but pay people back with blessings, as this is what our Father in heaven expects from us. Never punish an innocent child for the sins of their parents, as no child was forced to be born. I hope you enjoyed the story.